Good evening, and what a pleasure it is to begin this new month by having yet another conversation on the Pan-African forums. Welcome to everybody who is joining us, whether you are with us here in the Zoom webinar or you are on YouTube. We are so thrilled that you have joined us for this third conversation in a series of online conversations that we are having, amplifying African perspectives on a range of social, economic, and political issues. Those of you who have joined us before will know that this is the third in a series of conversations where we are featuring intellectuals from the global African world. And we hope that these forums will enrich ongoing conversations within and amongst the range of conceptual, geographical, ideological, and linguistic regions of Africa, helping us to envision and better work at the potential and possibilities of moving beyond the narrow confines of our nation states. We have, of course, in this series, chosen to reflect on the practical meaning of the identity Africa in relation to the whole range of challenges that are facing us. And so it is such a pleasure. My name is Mishai Mwangola, to be able to anchor these conversations with intellectuals who are reflecting on the range of ideas, realities, challenges, experiences, possibilities, and visions that come with using Africa as a basis for collectively imagining and organizing to the future that we want to live in. Our seminal conversations are already available. If you haven't had a chance to catch them, please look them up. You will find them on the Alliance Française de Nairobi's YouTube page under the name the Pan-African Forums. You will also find them on the Elephant, www.theelephant.info, under the Elephant TV, and just look again for the Pan-African Forums. And today, I cannot tell you how excited I am to be speaking to Mwalimu Horace Campbell. Mwalimu Campbell has had a long history of not just teaching, but working and living the experience of Pan-Africanism. Many of you will know that he is a professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University, but he is also known to very many on the continent as a teacher, as somebody who has inspired and worked in the academy in many places, including Makerere University, the University of Dar es Salaam, and of course at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, Legon, amongst many, many other places that he has worked, where he was the third Kwame Nkrumah chair. He is, and often, one of the comments that we have often gotten back is that, academics just talk and talk and talk and don't do much. But I'm hoping that I could get him to also just tell us what it means that he is an executive member of the North American delegation of the Pan-African Congress. Even before we started, with this conversation, we've been having a lot of thinking together, reflecting together on what this means. So without much ado, I want to just jump straight into the conversation. If you are joining us on Zoom and have a question, let me encourage you to put it in the Q&A, and I'll be coming to that as we proceed through the conversation today. If you are on YouTube, please feel free to put it in the comments, and we'll be harvesting those and bringing them into this conversation. But once again, karibu to everybody who is joining us from wherever you are in the world, and most special welcome to Mwalimu Horace Campbell. Mwalimu, let me start by just saying, if from the very beginning, as long as I have known you, you have defined for me what it means to not only teach and constantly think about Pan-Africanism, not just in terms of the theory, but in terms of how it practically has weight in the world that we live. And perhaps for me, let me start by asking, what should I be thinking about when we say Pan-Africanism? Sometimes it seems such a big concept. It seems something that's so theoretically rich that it becomes really, really difficult just to break it down into everyday speech. So how would you define Pan-Africanism?
Well, let me thank you first for inviting me on this forum. I did hear about this forum because my brother was on the forum and I followed what he had to say. And I'm united with my brother through Tajuddin. Both
And
of
this is
us
Brian
have,
Goro we're talking about.
well, yes, Brian has great love for Tajuddin,
Yes.
and worked with Tajuddin in seeking to build the movement. And Brian continues to be a member of the International Steering Committee of the Global Pan-African Movement, with all of the contradictions within our movement. And Godwin is the executive director of the Codestria, a major Pan-African organization. And that sister, who you remind me of her name?
Zuki Swawana?
Yes, that sister whose work is to bring to life what our cultural leaders are doing. So I'm pleased to be associated with this new way of discussing the challenges for our survival as human beings. And Shai, I'm also in our brief conversation that we had before we start. It gratified me. Here you are from East Africa, working with cultural leaders and artists and teachers from West Africa. That is, in your own life, you're trying to show what it means to transcend these borders that colonialism imposed on us. And I think if you ask me for a definition of Pan-Africanism, is how do we transcend those borders, and how do we affirm our humanity? Because that's what Pan-Africanism is about. It's about the affirmation of the humanity as human beings. And this affirmation has gone through many, many different iterations, many different changes. So the affirmation, at one point, the affirmation meant that Africans are human beings and should not be enslaved. Now, that is fundamentally the starting point of Pan-Africanism, that Africans are human beings. So if you ask me 4 or 5 things that define Pan-Africanism today, the first is that Africans are human beings. Second, that Africans should have life and live on the continent. Thirdly, Africans should have health. As basic human beings have the health, and by health we mean physical, mental, spiritual, and sexual health, and that our education system should reproduce that health. And fourthly, Africans should live in a clean environment. And all of this is linked to repair of the human spirit. So that is our understanding of Pan-Africanism. And I've been writing and thinking and reflecting on Pan-Africanism from the point of view of the affirmation of our humanity and our dignity.
Prof, when we talk about Africans, and it's interesting you've used that term, often, you know, there's so many ways of understanding who Africans are. I know Professor Zeleza has talked about Africa is such a wide concept, whether it's geographic, historic. There's so many ways of defining it. And one of the questions that comes up is, who are Africans when you talk about that?
Well, it is a question that fundamentally comes down to who are human beings. Because the African person is the person who transformed human beings in the development of speech, in the development of writing. And this transformation meant that humanity broke off into different areas of the world with different pigmentation. And so ultimately, everybody is an African, ultimately.
That's true.
But the experiences of the past 400 years, that is, especially after the transatlantic slave trade, has assigned a particular responsibilities to those who are Black Africans, those whose pigmentation are Black. So the definition of Africans, we do not join that discussion, because in the Pan-African movement, it's not the designation of who is an African, is who is aligned to the Pan-African liberation struggle. And at the conference of the 7th Pan-African Congress, this question was raised directly. So we had 5 definitions of Africans. Historically, the Africans of pigment, or Black people who were exploited through the slave trade. Secondly, people who have made their home in Africa, who, whether through migration, over the past 700 years, especially those who live in North Africa, and those, some of them have been Islamicized and Arabized, but they're African, whether they like it or not. Thirdly, there are people who have traveled to Africa and lived and worked in Africa who are now of Indian descent, but are Africans, like Issa Shivji or Piagama Pinto. And then we have the other peoples of African descent who live in other parts of the world. One of the reasons we try to stay away from this definition of Africans based on pigment is that we should not internalize European conceptions of humans and European conceptions of dividing human beings. And so Africans in the global Pan-African movement will have to transcend the European idea of human beings and raise it to another level. That's why when we have brothers and sisters in the Pan-African movement, like Yash Tandon, like Issa Shivji, like Piagama Pinto, we should be teaching our young people about their role in the global Pan-African struggle and the struggles for Pan-African freedom. So the Pan-Africanism at all time seeks to elevate the question of human beings to a higher level than that which was defined by the Europeans. That was done by the first Africans who fought against enslavement. The first thing they did in fighting against enslavement and affirming their humanity, say we must link ourselves to the indigenous persons. So the First Nation peoples who came from Haiti, or the Taino people who were killed, they named the country after them as an act of solidarity with the First Nation people in Haiti. So it is always clear in the minds of Africans in struggle that they're linked to other peoples in struggle.
Could you, and now that we're talking about some of those beginnings and those histories, that when we talk about Pan-Africanism today, it's very much anchored and rooted in struggles that have gone on for different generations. And each generation, if I may quote Fanon, finds what it is in that moment that is the focus of their struggle. I wondered, and I know you did mention the 7th Pan-African struggle, and when we had our conversation with Brian, we talked about you have the organized Pan-African movement that is more familiar to people in terms of a group of people who come together, who identify with a movement. And you did mention Tajuddin Abdurrahman, which many people know as somebody who really is identified with that organizing around it. And then you also have a time or groups of people who perhaps were not using the term Pan-Africanism when they started out, but they very much are linked to this history of struggle. I'm wondering if you could take us, just because I've seen some of, and I've heard you speak on some of this very, very rich history of Pan-Africanism, how it came together. And so that when we talk about Pan-Africanism today, we are talking about this sense of a united movement that may have many aspects and manifest differently, but there is this core, this history that we look at to inspire, that has given us a framework to organize within. I wonder if you could take us back to some of that history.
Yes, thank you. I think this is very important in framing what inspires the Pan-African movement and the Pan-African struggle, because the first Pan-Africanists were the enslaved, who were fighting to define themselves at a higher level than those who had enslaved them. And so the first Pan-Africanists were the enslaved who said, I'm a human being. Now, as their definition as a human being and not as chattel slavery, they developed family structures, and the first thing they developed on the slave ship was the concept of shipmate. Shipmate meant that you from different parts of Africa, the person you're in this whole of the ship becomes your family member. Mm. And that concept of a new sense of family was carried over into the regions of the world where these Africans were to be found. And so those Africans started communities, like the communities they call maroon communities. These were the first free communities of enslaved people. But the first major manifestation of Pan-African struggle, and the most important for the global Pan-African movement, were the struggles against enslavement, especially in Haiti. The people of Haiti established first and foremost the dignity of the African, and that in one blow, the revolutionaries in Haiti, as C.L.R. James wrote in the book, The Black Jacobins, one day they were enslaved people in the field. The next day there were diplomats leading armies, defeating France, Britain, Spain, all together. So the Haitian Revolution in one blow ended slavery, ended colonialism, ended white supremacy. And that had a profound impact on the entire planet Earth, because the freedom struggle in South America derived its inspiration from Haiti. Haiti financed Simon Bolivar and those who were fighting for freedom in South America. It had an impact on Blacks who were fighting in other parts of the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Barbados. It had an impact in the United States of America. In fact, the present configuration of the United States of America came from the blow of the people of Haiti to France, so that Napoleon sold what was half of the United States from France to the United States, what was called the Louisiana Purchase. So the impact of the Haitian Revolution was very profound at so many different levels. So the foundation of the struggle for the humanity of Africans is in the enslaved. Now, at different moments, we had another view of the Pan-Africanism. At the time of colonialism, racism, eugenics, Africans said, well, Pan-Africanism meant ending colonial rule. And so they called conferences and meetings and organizations around ending colonialism. At another moment, Pan-Africanism meant ending apartheid. And there was a global struggle organized with solidarity in all parts of Africa. And that was one of the clearest moments of collaboration of Africans to end white supremacy in Southern Africa. At another moment, the Pan-African movement ending Jim Crow and the systemic white racism in the United States of America and the rest of the world. That Pan-African struggle is still going on. Today, the Pan-African movement is defined by repairing the human spirit and the unification of Africa. So there are two main tasks of the Pan-African movement, the Pan-African struggle. One, humanizing the planet, that is having healthy human beings. And secondly, unification and freedom of Africa at home and abroad. So that is our understanding of the Pan-African movement. But I should warn you, my sister, that in the Pan-African movement, there are as many definitions of Pan-Africanism as there are Pan-African theories. So one will have to decide for themselves. And we do not believe that you can have a unified view of Pan-Africanism because there are different experiences among the Pan-African world. And as our sister, Professor Mugo, said, Pan-Africanism comes from the lived experiences of the Pan-African movement. And if you would ask, who are the vanguard of the Pan-African movement today, she said, it's the women and the youth, especially oppressed women, who are like the heart and the essence of the Pan-African movement. So this is a movement that the African woman especially from the grassroots, have redefined what it means to be a human being. That is the bodily integrity of the woman, their rights as women, whatever their sexual orientation. So the whole terrain of the discussion of Pan-Africanism has been reframed by revolutionary Pan-Africanists like Michio Mugo or Ifeoma Dume. And so we are at a complete different level. Let me just tell you a story which brought this to the forefront. At the Fifth Pan-African Conference in 1945, which was a major turning point in the celebration of Pan-Africanism, you had this man who was organizing the Pan-African movement, but he put his children into an orphanage while he's doing Pan-African work. His children wrote a book called In Search of Mr. Mackenzie. That is the two daughters who wrote about their father who was in the Pan-African movement, but they were in an orphanage. In other words, the point that the women were making, you cannot be out there talking about Pan-Africanism when you are not practicing it at home in terms of care and family. So the terrain of the understanding of Pan-Africanism has changed substantially because of the intervention of radical Pan-African women. I would recommend people who want to talk about Pan-Africanism and the Fifth Pan-African Congress to say, yes, that was an important moment. What did the woman say about the Fifth Pan-African Conference?
Okay, I'm definitely going to look that up. That is so interesting. And what I'm really appreciating is the way everything you are saying takes us back to what you talked about. We're looking at what it means to be human and how that humanity is expressed, how people struggle to make sure, whether it is in enslavement or people who are colonized or people who are suffering from a whole range of oppressions, to say that I say no to these oppressions and I will use this as a basis of struggle. You were saying that, and I was thinking about a conversation that we were having earlier. And I think some of the things that people struggle with Pan-Africanism is that it is so big and it is at the same time very specific. And one of the comments that we were talking about was, you've just talked about, there was a moment when the focus was apartheid. There was a moment when it was colonialism. There was a moment when we were looking at Jim Crow. And, from the perspective of now we're in 2020, does Pan-Africanism ever fight a battle and it ends? Because I look at apartheid and then, you look at some of the stories and what comes out of the spaces where apartheid has been a big issue. And sometimes it feels like, we think a battle is won and then we move on to another one. And then this force comes back. I would ask you, is colonialism over? Have we defeated colonialism so that we can say that we have moved on? Is Jim Crow over? Could you take us through some of these struggles? And what I've really appreciated is the way you've linked us and said different people fighting in different eras, in different spaces, have still found a common ground for them to organize around, even as they look at the specificities of their own struggle. Are these struggles, do they ever end?
Well, how could they end? How could they end when we are still confused about our humanity? When the entire educational system, the social and economic system is meant to dehumanize us. And when the people of Haiti fought in 1791 and 1804 for independence, they thought they had ended oppression. They had set up a republic. 200 years later, we see how France forced the Haitian people to pay a debt. And that is why one of the questions about Pan-Africanism today is to educate people about what France owes the people of Haiti. And the first thing to educate them about that is to talk about the Haitian Revolution and the majesty of the Haitian Revolution. Let us take the question of apartheid as a turning point in the Pan-African struggle. Because there's no question that ending apartheid opened avenues for new possibilities. The African Union would not have been possible without the end of apartheid. The World Conference Against Racism would not have been possible without the end of apartheid. But what we do know, at every moment of the Pan-African struggles, the enemies of Pan-Africanism came in to redefine the meaning of Pan-Africanism and to suppress Pan-Africanism. I want to give you 3 examples. First, Kwame Nkrumah was someone who learned about Pan-Africanism from the Garveyites when he was a student in the United States of America. Kwame Nkrumah went back to Ghana, joined the struggles of the people of Ghana, and supported the unification of Africa. Not only did they overthrow Kwame Nkrumah, but if you went on the State Department website about the discussions that they were having, is that the United States was afraid of this idea of Pan-Africanism gaining ground in Africa. Same thing with Kenya. At the time of Kameka, the Pan-African movement of Eastern and Central Africa, when Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda were the center of Pan-Africanism, to the point that we had an East African community with one currency, one legislature. And a lot of people talk about the African currency today as if we did not have an African currency that was killed by the West. So the imagination of the youth do not know we've done this before. But then the intellectual arena, the leading intellectuals, decided to redefine Pan-Africanism. One of the leading international relations scholars called Joseph Nye wrote a book called Pan-Africanism in East Africa, where they were going to denigrate Pan-Africanism to the point where young people do not want to associate Pan-Africanism. So that, so the idea was that you would denigrate Pan-Africanism. And so when I went to the Teachers College at the University of Nairobi to talk about Pan-Africanism, they said, well, why should we want to learn about that? The third example I want to use is in the end of apartheid. The peasants of Tanzania, peasants of Mozambique and Angola, in their Pan-African solidarity, made a contribution to the South African liberation. At the end of South African liberation, Western foundations and institutions spent $1 billion to turn the schools, universities, and institutions away from Pan-African solidarity to create a class of Africans who look down on other Africans. So that in South Africa, today, you'll hear people talk about governance and human rights. $1 billion were spent to do this. And so most students in South Africa do not know that Nelson Mandela was free and apartheid ended because of the collaboration of the peoples of Africa, the Cubans fighting at Kutko Valley to defeat the South African army, and the international solidarity. And so when a section of the South African leadership internalizes the ideas of the West, then you have xenophobia against other Africans. So that Mozambicans who made major sacrifice for South Africans, they're thrown out of South Africa. And so what we have seen that Pan-Africanism and Pan-African solidarity does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in a context where there's a contention of ideas about how to go forward.
Mwalimu, James Gondi is wondering if you might say a little bit about the nexus between Pan-Africanism and African socialism as espoused by Jaramogi Oginga, Pio Gama Pinto, and others in the anti-colonial movement.
Okay. Well, the conception of African socialism was an awareness by all of the leaders who came out of the anti-colonial struggles that the ideas of individualism, private property, accumulation by a few would not be in the interest of the transformation of Africa. So they gravitated towards ideas about African personhood, African familyhood, and African social collectivism. And so socialism was a gesticulation towards another concept of being human. Unfortunately, some of the people who were articulating the African socialism rooted their understanding of African socialism in European history and not in what Sheikh Anta Diop calls the cultural unity of Africa, which Ifeoma Dume has gone on to develop in talking about the goddess principle, African family structures, and the centrality of matriarchy. So that is continuously a struggle in the development idea of socialism in Africa. So the ideas that African socialism came from Odinga, from Nyerere, was a recognition that the ideas of private property, ownership of other human beings, are antithetical to the transformation and the development of us as human beings. But socialism, I think I would urge this person to go and read what Sheikh Anta Diop means by social collectivism. And the development of these concepts would be very important. And socialism is on the agenda, whether you call it African socialism, because of the very basic needs. One of the things that I write about in Africa is the relationship between democracy and water. You cannot have access to water in Africa without having it based on a principle of shared resource for everyone. So African rivers like the Congo River, the Nile River, the Niger River, in the context where Africa is facing global warming, what is the social project of rolling back environmental disaster? We have to share the waters of the Congo River. We have to replenish Lake Chad by building a major canal from the Congo to Lake Chad and uniting Africa, creating a new highways and changing the whole structure of Africa. And that can only come through a social project which sees the ownership of water resources as a collective resource, not as an individual resource of any one society or country. So these ideas are on the table. The question is, in the context of Cold War politics and the universities as they are structured today, many of our young people are confused about social collectivism, cooperation, or sharing. And they do not know that African independence came from sharing and cooperation at every level by the people.
I want us to start to, and we will go in the second part of the conversation to really talk about, and where you already are, what are the tasks for now? Where are the different spheres of work? But one of the, I think, one of the strongest reactions we had to the conversations that we had in the first series with Brian, Godwin, and Zukiswa, was that a lot of people were really struck by the mention of the congresses. And a lot of people, I know in those conversations, we very much talked about the 5th Congress going forward, especially with Brian. And there were people who were really interested in how did the idea of having regular Pan-African Congresses start? What happened in the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th? And then what happened? And actually somebody who saw your bio when we tweeted it, came back to me and said, oh, I've really been wanting to hear about these Pan-African Congresses because I only ever thought of them as the political party in South Africa. And I really would like to know a little bit more about that. I know it's a very big topic, which we could spend the entire 90 minutes talking through the Congresses, but I wondered if you could just talk us through a little bit of information on that so that those who are not familiar with that sense of an organized coming together and people thinking through what's happening in different spaces in the moment, and then moving on to the next. And I think the biggest question was, might there be another one? We know that the 8th one, something happened, but then is there any plan, since you're a member of the North American delegation, is there any plans to move forward? But maybe if you could give us some history and then bring us to the present, and how do we go into the future? In fact, that person was saying, I want to be at the next one, if there is one.
Okay. There's a book that I want to recommend to young people. It's a book of postcards of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, which is a living example of someone who worked within the Pan-African movement. And in one of the postcards, Tajuddin said, it's time to take Pan-Africanism from congresses to the Pan-Africanism of the people on the streets, the people who are the traders, the people who are the teachers, who are the soldiers. And so that we have to make an understanding that what were the driving forces that brought about the Pan-African Congress, and we do not isolate and understand the Pan-African movement at the level of congresses. The Pan-African movement at the level of congresses was only a meeting point, and I can say something about what drove those meeting points. So, in the 19th century, the driving force behind Pan-Africanism was the question of the humanity of the African. And that had nothing to do with congresses, whether it was the David Walker appeal. I'd ask your audience to listen to the David Walker appeal about the brothers and sisters of all parts of the world lifting up their dignity as human beings, or the fight against enslavement in the United States of America. Now, in the 19th century, the Pan-African movement was called Ethiopianism. That is because most of the people who came to Pan-Africanism came out of the Bible because they were literate. And in the Bible, Psalms chapter 23 says, princes come out of Egypt, Ethiopia stretch forth our hands unto God. They interpret that as that Africa would be delivered by Ethiopia. So when the Ethiopians fought in 1896 to defeat the Italians at Adowa, that drove the Pan-African spirit to the point where by 1933, 1935, when the Italians invaded Abyssinia, Africans wanted to march from Botswana to Ethiopia to fight against the Italians. All of this is part of the history of Pan-Africanism. So the Pan-African spirit of solidarity has always been there. So what drove the first meeting? The partition of Africa in 1884. The partition of Africa in 1884 was one of the most brutal stages in human history, because in 1884, the Europeans carried out genocide in Africa. Most people would not have known that in a very short period of time, the Belgians killed 10 million people in the Congo. This book by Adam Hochschild, King Leopold Ghost, would give that story about killing 10 million people. So colonialism, forced labor, taxes, conscription, putting Africans as people in zoos. So the response in the spirit of Africans that a few African intellectuals came together in 1900 to call a Pan-African conference. And that was when the word Pan-African came into the lexicon. It was a conference to say, we must end the colonial occupation of Africa. So it was in response at a particular, to chart a course. And over the next 45 years, we had different congresses that were called by different intellectuals. But at every point, we have to distinguish between what was going on in the Pan-African Congress and what's going on the street. For example, before the 5th Pan-African Conference, there were 3 major Pan-African movements that were driving the question of African dignity. One was the Maurids in Senegal. The other was Simon Kimbangu and the Kimbanguists in the Congo. The other was the Rastafari movement in the Caribbean, the Rastafari movement, which is one of the most important Pan-African formations because it speaks to the dignity of Africans. I myself identify with that movement, and one of the great spokespersons of that movement is Bob Marley. So we make a distinction between Pan-Africanism of the Rastafari or the Kimbanguists and the movements had manifested in conferences. The conferences came together at moments when they signaled the direction that Africa should go in. So what was the signal at the 1945 conference? Ending colonialism. At that point, the British, French, and the Europeans were talking about having Africa for 100 years. So the Pan-African intellectual culture articulated in writing what it meant to decolonize Africa. And leaders like Nkrumah picked that up. The Sixth Pan-African Conference emerged out of the anti-colonial struggle at the fall of Portuguese colonialism and the merger of the merger of those forces. I'm going to respond to that question about Bandung. I won't forget. Okay, but at that moment of the Sixth Pan-African Conference, and I would like to correct Brian on that question of the Sixth Pan-African Conference, because I was an activist in that conference. The Sixth Pan-African Conference came 2 months after the fall of the Portuguese, and it was to chart the course of linking with the liberation movements so that African governments do not speak for the liberation movements. And the biggest delegation at that conference was the North American delegation in that conference. I have a book about this called Towards the Sixth Pan-African Conference. And Walter Rodney wrote a very important essay. Now, Brian made a statement about the conference, about the Caribbean delegation. And I think historically, we need to correct that the Caribbean delegation boycotted the conference because the governments of the Caribbean said that the only persons who should be in the Sixth Pan-African Conference should be representative of governments. So the Sixth Pan-African Conference was a very important conference, and that's it. The Seventh Pan-African Conference raised the question of the unification of Africa and placed the question of unification and reparations on the agenda. Let me come back to the person who put something in the chat about Garveyism and about Bandung.
Let me just read about so that those who are not in the Zoom webinar can be aware of what it is. And this is coming from, it's a comment from YouTube. What is the legacy of the Bandung Conference of 1956 for Pan-Africanists and the place of African-Asian solidarity in light of the rise of China in the 21st century? Garvey and company were actively crusading for, quote, African for Africans, unquote. So so-called Africans were either too meek or impassive to take up the challenge. Okay.
Yes. I want to thank the person who made that point, because usually when we talk about Pan-African conferences and Pan-African congresses, we miss out the impact of the Garvey movement, which is different from Marcus Garvey itself. The Garvey movement was the largest Pan-African movement of the 20th century, had 4 million members, branches in all parts of the world. And the Garvey movement was another manifestation of Pan-Africanism at grassroots, because the people who anchored the Garvey movement were the workers, poor farmers, and the colonialists were frightened of Marcus Garvey. And for that reason, they do not want people to learn about Marcus Garvey and the unification of Africa today. On the question of Bandung, the global Pan-African movement was a very central component of the Bandung process. And I want to see Bandung as a process, because in 1927, when they called the conference of the League Against Imperialism in Belgium, the Pan-Africanists from Africa, especially from South Africa, were part of this League Against Imperialism. And in the 1930s, especially after the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, there was an explosion of Pan-African activity of anti-imperialism all over the world. The Bandung Conference in 1955 was a continuation of the League Against Imperialism, and one of the main base of this conference were the people from Egypt and from the rest of Africa. And I may add, people from the anti-racist struggles in the United States of America. The Bandung Conference laid down the conditions for peace, bread, and justice. The Pan-African movement was one of the foundations of the Bandung process. And the Bandung process was strengthened by the anti-apartheid struggles. Now, what does this have to do with China? At that moment of Bandung, the anchor of anti-colonialism brought the Chinese, who said they've just gone through a period of imperial domination, brought India in, but the glue that held the Bandung and non-aligned movement together in organizations such as UNCTAD was the global Pan-African movement. Now, the contribution of Africans towards ending the isolation of China is very important here. Throughout the period when the Cold War was going on, from 1949 to 1971, the United States refused to recognize the People's Republic of China. And the global Pan-African movement, led by Tanzania, were the forces to end the isolation of China. In fact, when Ahmed Salem, who was then the representative of Tanzania at the United Nations, pushed through the votes in the Security Council, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon called Africans monkeys because of their solidarity with China. Now, today, some of the Chinese leadership who have internalized Western views of capitalism have forgotten the role that China played in the non-aligned movement. So we can make a distinction between the current leaders of China who are integrated with global capitalism and the Chinese leadership under Mao Tse-tung worked in Tanzania to build the Tanzam Railroad to ensure Africans would fight against apartheid. So we have to periodize what is happening in China. And Africans themselves must be very clear about what their relationship will be with the Chinese people in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's really gives us food for thought. And I want to come to now talking about the present moment and the tasks that are there. And I think you've already taken us there. But before I do, Moses Sichach asks, as a young Kenyan, I wonder if it's too late to roll it back to African social collectiveness. For me, Pan-Africanism always tilts towards sentiment of an Africa that no longer exists. Has globalization, westernization fundamentally changed the African to a point that Pan-Africanism can only remain as an ideology? In other words, that there is no practical transition to political reality?
I don't know where to start, because that question presupposes that this young person did not hear anything that I said before. Let me take one Pan-African proposition that we have been hammering home. Africans are human beings.
Yes.
And if Africans are human beings, the health of the African should mean that in terms of how our society is organized, it should be organized around the health of the person. The health pandemics, and I would recommend to the person to read a book called Medical Apartheid, Experimentation on Black People in the United States of America. Because the experimentation meant that Africans were subhumans, and therefore doctors could experiment on them for the health of white people. So a Pan-African Health Project is about the affirmation of the health of the African. And that question of Pan-African health direction is so urgent today in the era of COVID. You remember when we started talking out, we talked about the fact that in the month of November, 4 million persons were affected by COVID in the United States of America. The majority of those persons were affected by corona is the African descendants and Black and brown persons. So the Pan-African Health Project is about how to get universal health care for African persons. So the corona process the Corona Challenge has told us why it is what this young person called globalization. That is the era of corporations giving themselves the right to patent life forms. And the Pan-African movement is always against the ideas of corporations as persons and the intellectual property rights, meaning that the drugs and vaccines should not be available to Africans. This is a practical example of what Pan-Africanism means today. I want to give him another example. The question of shared water resources. The shared water resources of Africa. How do we rationalize the collective use of the Nile River between Ethiopia and Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya? These are Pan-African questions, are not questions of yesterday. Questions of Tsetse Fly. If he's from Kenya, he would know that there's a whole region between Tanga and Mombasa, nearly as big as Texas, that you cannot do any farming because of Tsetse Fly. So it requires cooperation and collaboration across borders. So whether it's health, water, housing, education, technology, satellites, telephone, currency. Let me come to this one now, because Kwame Nkrumah talked about the unification of Africa and the African currency. Africa can never be free until Africans have freedom of movement across Africa, and the foremost Pan-Africanists in East Africa are the Maasai, but the Maasai do not recognize the borders between Kenya and Tanzania. But Africa cannot be free when the resources of Africa are taken out of Africa through the integration of Africa into the Bretton Woods institution, which is the World Bank and the IMF, because those are institutions that ensure illicit capital flight from Africa, so that $1 trillion that could have gone into the reconstruction of Africa is taken out of Africa. So yes, Kwame Nkrumah talked about practically that Africa must have its own currency. Now, what happened when the Pan-African movement placed the question of African currency on the table? Gaddafi picked it up. When Gaddafi picked up the question of African currency, he says, yes, I'm going to use the $200 billion of the Libyan reserves. I'm not going to keep it in Western bank. We're going to use this as a basis for the African currency. What happened to Gaddafi? He was killed. I would urge you to put up on your chat the email that Sarkozy, the man who was the president of France, who's now on trial for corruption, sent to Hillary Clinton on the reasons for invading Libya. And one of the reasons was that the African currency was a threat to the euro, because the French depend on exploiting African countries that hold the CFA francs. So we have to understand that the question of the African currency is linked to the freedom of movement. Somebody just put up in the chat, the African Continental Free Trade Area. The African Continental Free Trade Area will be meaningless without an African currency, because the Chinese do not want an African currency. The European Union does not want an African currency. The United States do not want an African currency, because these three currencies, the dollar, the euro, the RMB, they are depending on the resources of Africa to ensure that Africans do not control their own resources. So I hope this young person is disabused of the idea that if this young person uses a cell phone to communicate with you, the African Union and unity means that we need an African satellite. So we do not have to use a satellite of other countries. We're going to have one army, one satellite, one currency, one telecommunication system, one one foreign diplomatic system so that the Africans at home and abroad can be defended by Africans, just as how the Haitian Revolution in 1791 defended Africans in every part of the world.
Wow, that's very rich. And so the question then, and I'm wondering if we can start to talk about this. Where are some of the spheres that people can practically engage? I'm thinking through the question as it was asked, and I know his emphasis was on political realities, and I'm wondering if his thinking is also in the realm of politics. That I know I saw something earlier on Twitter where somebody's comment to this to this advertisement of this webinar was looking at the kind of rhetoric, and they were saying, you know, in my country, we even had a minister who was supposed to be looking at the issues of Pan-Africanism and all this working together at independence, and all of that has just died. So what are some of the spheres that people can mobilize and work in? I know you've also spoken quite a bit on the role of academia in terms of both research and teaching. And I wonder, and I think earlier on you had mentioned music. So I wonder if you can just expand on, if I'm somebody who's sitting and I'm thinking, okay, I love this, I want to be more involved. Where is the work? Where are some more? I think you've already began talking about that in terms of when we think about cross-border work that needs to be done on some of these big projects. But let's just call out some of those big spheres of action.
Well, I won't go to big sphere of action. I will go to the question of the humanity, of the human being. If you are seeking to become a human being, it means that your humanity is linked up with the humanity of others. That's the essence of Utu and Ubuntu. And that is not an academic question. That's a question of how you live your life, how you interact with your children, with your brothers and sisters, with women, with men, with people of a different sexual orientation. So that in your own life, if you affirm the idea of Ubuntu, that is, you have a concept of your humanity that is linked to the humanity of others, then you will not entertain ideas which separate you from other human beings. So ideas about ethnic differentiation, which is used by politicians to divide people. Pan-Africanism means that you'll never buy into anything in Kenya about Kikuyus and Luos. You talk about the working peoples of Kenya and see how the Kikuyu or Luo language can enrich the peoples of Kenya in their culture, in their schools. That is one. Secondly, in relationship to the relations between men and women, we have already spoken about the book written by the daughters of Mr. Mackenzie, In Search of Mr. Mackenzie. Pan-Africanism is fundamentally about care. There's an article on Pan-Africanism. When people talked about Pan-Africanism and women, the first question the woman said was, hello, what does it mean? Said, where have you been? So what you're saying, and those are the women who brought to my attention this book about In Search of Mr. Mackenzie, because the question of the sexual and bodily integrity of women in the Pan-African movement, the way in which the family is developed and the concept of the family, these are not theoretical questions. These are day-to-day questions of your day-to-day life. Thirdly, religions of differences, where people will go to church and they praise God and they praise the God of money, what is called prosperity religion, instead of the God of love and peace and sharing. And so that the very same person will go to church and talk about their being Christian or being Muslim and reproduce ideas of ethnic chauvinism or religious chauvinism. So one does not have to go to books or to write books about Pan-Africanism and the Pan-African. One has to see how this is manifest into day-to-day life and how you translate that now into how you relate to people of different ideas or classes and so forth. The point is that the Pan-African movement have been hijacked by states that domesticate Pan-Africanism for their own purposes. So today, we no longer talk about the anti-colonial struggle. Yeah. Last week, Western Sahara had some military differences with Morocco. Western Sahara is recognized by the African Union as an independent state. One of the cardinal principles of Pan-Africanism is that Pan-Africanism supports the end of colonialism. Do young people talk about the colonial territories in Africa, the colonial territories of France, that is Martinique, Guadeloupe, Cayenne, the colonial territory of United States in Puerto Rico? At the time of the independence struggle in Kenya, when Ras Makonnen went to Kenya because Kenyatta invited him there, the Puerto Rican struggle would be at the forefront of the discussion of the Kenyan struggle. So the struggles of Black people in Brazil, in Panama, in Haiti, these questions are no longer there. So I would like to remind our young people that if we read Michiro Mugo and we read about the lived experiences, then we're not talking the kind of discussion we have about Pan-Africanism, something coming from leaders.
You know, as you were talking about that, I remember one of, she does write about this, and you know, it's really very practical, very simple, but it makes you think about it, of being at home and somebody comes in, and you know, as we do, you know, greeting everybody in the homestead, but he asks, is anybody here? And what this person in and asking that question was doing was not seeing all the women and all the girls who are present. And so her mother's response was a very, you know, put this man in place by saying, I think something like, no, we're not here. There are no humans here. So I think he asked, is there any human here? And he said, just the goats and the chicken or something like that. And I think the point you're making is that we start where we are. We start in the practical spaces that we engage. We start by thinking about how we affirm our own humanity and the places that we work and we engage in on a day-to-day basis. It's interesting you've taken us to the question of politics and how Pan-Africanism has played up in the realm of continental and international and all, you know, just the way we operate in the world. James Gondi asks, does the AU Agenda 2063 for the, quote, transformation of Africa and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area adequately represent the Pan-African vision of Nkrumah, Nyerere, Du Bois, and other fathers of the Pan-African movement? I notice he talks about the fathers, but for now we will let that one go.
Well, let me say this, that at all times in the Pan-African movement, you make compromises. And the compromise that was made in 2013 is that we have a 50-year period for the unification of Africa. But for many of us, that is too late. In 2007, 50 years after the independence of Ghana, there was a conference in Ghana of the African Union, and Tajuddin and the radical Pan-Africanists placed on the table in 2015, we should have a timetable for the unification of Africa. When are we going to have the African currency? When we're going to have the African common market? When we're going to have the African free trade area? Now, the killing of Gaddafi and the blackout of African governments in discussing the crimes of France, Britain, the United Arab Emirates against the peoples of North Africa is part of trying to crush 2063. So yes, there was a compromise in agreeing to 2063, but long before 2063, Africa will be united. Let me take this 10-year period, 2020 to 2030. What are some of the things that are going to happen in this period? One, the first thing that's happening, we are already in the midst of this, the Great Capitalist Depression, unemployment, GDP growth going down, health pandemic, systemic racism, wars. Out of that, we have what is going on is the revitalization of Africa. You have 1 billion young people. We have people who are eager for agreeing to the fact that Africa is for the Africans. So 2030 would come around, and what will be standing is that the country with the most vibrant youthful population is Africa. So the question is, how do we put in motion what is needed for the unification? What are the resources that we have in Africa that are not being used? Let me give you an example that I always give. The Chief Justice, past Chief Justice of Tanzania, the past Chief Justice of Kenya, and the past Chief Justice of Uganda are all people, you know. Othman, Kande Othman was the Chief Justice of Tanzania. Willy Mutunga was the Chief Justice. You know who that is? Mm-hmm. Did you get that?
Yeah.
Mutunga.
Yes.
The former Chief Justice.
Oh, immediate former Chief Justice in Kenya, yes.
Of Kenya. Now, what if we set in motion the legal and intellectual work to bring back the African currency? And this will not come out because politicians make an affirmation of an African currency. It will come from setting up capital markets. It will come from setting up the laws. It will come from setting up the protocols for the convergence of the current currencies in East Africa. It requires practical work. So when we talk about 2063, we have to unleash the intellectual and legal resources of the African continent towards 2063. 2063 will not come about because someone says, yes, we're going to unite by 2063. If we're going to build a canal from the Congo to Lake Chad, we're going to need 1 million engineers. We're going to need new technical cadres in Africa so that Africa can have water and not have cycles of drought and flood. So the whole question of planning for 2063 requires the kind of focus that the present African governments are afraid of, because the present African governments are conduit for stealing resources from Africa. So yes, we made a compromise at the time of the OAU. At the time of the OAU, Kwame Nkrumah says we should have the unification of Africa, and the OAU says no, we'll have non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. So Africans compromised, but in the OAU, there was a liberation committee of the OAU, headquarters in Tanzania. So they used that space. The Tanzanian government, the freedom fighters used that space to lead the OAU to the point of defeating apartheid. What I'm saying is that the same compromise was made by progressive Pan-Africanists with the African Union, with the president, to use that space to drive the question of the unification of Africa.
When we think of the...
Let me add one point. Without forgetting global Africa, because the present leaders of Africa, until the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd, forced the African Union to make a statement about police brutality and killing of Black people, the African Union was silent. When people are killed in France, African presidents go to France and march in solidarity against human lives in France. The African Union cut off the youth from the youth of the United States of America. So the Black Lives Matter movement has brought back the question of the integrity of the African. So yes, we have wonderful days ahead of us in the rejuvenation of Africa.
I was actually going to take you there, and I actually had two questions. One, there is this, when you ask the question about what's happening in the next 10 years, the first thing that came to mind is that the East African community is supposed to become a confederacy in 2023, I believe it is, and then build on to becoming a federation. So one question is, I know Africa, now we're thinking about the state-centric way of organizing in terms of Pan-Africanism, and there are 6 regions under that framework of Africa. Is that one route to go through the regions, having some form of uniting the regions, and then coming to the whole collective? And then my second related question is, what
Can
about...
Can you hold the second question?
Sure.
So we can deal with that first question.
Yes.
There was a debate in the 1960s about this very question. Nyerere said, we're going to work to build East Africa and build the East African Federation. Nkrumah said, that's a mistake because imperialism will crush you if you are not part of a larger African Union. In 1997, when Nyerere spoke at the 40th anniversary of Ghana independence, Nyerere said he was sorry, he made a mistake in going for East African Federation because the way the world is organized today, imperialism and the enemies of Africa will not allow any such federation to take root. That is why for 20 years we've been talking about East African Federation and Confederation, and we have not got where we were in 1977. We had a common currency, common legislature, common post and telecommunications, common university system, East Africa. We have not got where we were 40 years ago. So the Kwame Nkrumah position about the unification of the African continent is correct. But let's bear in mind that if East Africa would be the first, let's say the 6 countries of East Africa create an African currency, and the 6 countries of East Africa then brought in the Congo, and brought in Angola, and then bring in other countries, because if we can see from the European Union, the European Union did not come to the euro all at once, at one moment. So to think that the African currency is going to come one day when Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and Burundi, and Rwanda, and South Sudan come together and say, well, no, it's not going to happen like that. It's going to come through the struggles of Africans who have the idea that we have to delink and that we should not be keeping our reserves in the Federal Reserve of New York or in the euro. And those reserves are better invested in water supplies, health systems, transportation, communication system. It requires a whole new mindset in Africa for us to move in that direction, to move from this idea. So I do not, and the progressive Pan-Africanists do not support the regional route of NEPAD, because what France has shown in West Africa with the countries that are tied to the CFA is that they'll hold on to these African countries and they'll create mischief, as they're doing in Niger and Mali and Central African Republic, to ensure that Africa does not unite. But if there are regions that have political harmony to drive forward, and I think one such region is Kenya, and as I said to you before the discussion, that's why we're investing so much time. That's why Tajuddin lived in Kenya. We understand the legacy of Makerere University, that so many people from East Africa went through the same institution, Ngogi, Mishiri, Nyerere, or Benin Kappa. There's a certain sense already in East Africa that can lay the foundation for the unification of Africa.
My second part of the question, and I think is when we talk about the unification of Africa, what happens to all the other Africans who are not on the physical continent of Africa, everybody else who's all over the rest of the world, global Africa? How do they fit into this conversation?
Oh, they are very central to it. First, the unification of Africa will be the condition for supporting the independence in all parts of the world. That is, all of those people of African descent are under colonial rule. Secondly, the reparations question. Now, the reparations question is one of the #1 questions of the global Pan-African movement. And the reparations question is being led by the former enslaved peoples in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean Reparations Commission have been having meetings with the leaders of Ghana and the leaders of Kenya. They've gone there and they've pinpointed the Caribbean Reparations Commission before the African Union. The African Union is afraid of reparations because many of the leaders of the African Union cannot say to France, Belgium, Britain, Germany that you committed crimes in Africa, because so many of the children of some of those leaders were active participants in the slave trade. So the global Pan-African movement and reparative justice unites the people of Africa with the people of outside of Africa. But it's not just only in reparations, because we're not talking about money. We're talking about repairing the relations between Africa and the rest of the world. But let's give you an example. In the climate discussion about global warming, there are many countries in the world, in the African Union, 54 countries. There are the Caribbean countries that are in CARICOM, 15 countries. There are the countries of Central America that are in the Central American organizations. In the Caribbean, in the past month, the countries of Central America and the countries of the Caribbean brought forward programs for pushing forward climate justice in the world. And this is one area where if Africans see the alliance of Africans globally in dealing with the climate debt, that is how to reverse global warming, we'll realize some of the outcome of Bandung. We'll put Bandung alive because that's the alliance of the Caribbean people, Central American people with African people in dealing with questions of global warming.
That's absolutely great, because 2 questions that are up and had come up was to do with that. Nganga Wahumushiri says, thank you for the comments and presentation. I'd love Professor Campbell to speak a bit more about the intersection between Pan-Africanism and the kind of actions we must take in mitigating climate change moving forward. And then we also had a comment on YouTube where the question was, Prof has spoken about the role of Wangari Maathai as a central Pan-African figure in the face of climate change. What are his thoughts on African solidarity in regard to ecological justice for all of its people? I think you've spoken a little bit already about climate change. Would you want to add any other thoughts, especially to do?
Yes, especially for that young man who asked about globalization. If he's from Kenya, I wonder if he heard about the Great Green Wall of Africa. The Great Green Wall of Africa was a proposition of Wangari Maathai of how to humanize the planet. That the Great Green Wall is to build a wall 7,000 kilometers, 15 kilometers wide from East Africa to West Africa to repair the global warming in Africa. So these are, it's now been accepted by the Paris Climate Accord that they will support the Great Green Wall of Africa. But because Africa is organized around states, if you go to Niger, you go to the capital of Niger, and you see where 40 years ago they planted trees. The place they planted trees have been turned into private property of persons, and that private property means that it's either a garbage dump or a housing area. So when you think about the Great Green Wall of Africa and planting trees, or you think about the canal system of uniting Africa to replenish Lake Chad, you're talking about a different mindset beyond neoliberalism, which brings back question of social collectivism and sharing. You cannot talk about global warming and reversing global warming and planting trees and then give it to private individuals to turn it into whatever it is for them to make profit.
Okay, the time has just flown past, and I want to ask you to make your closing comments. I do have one comment, and I think the thing that's really struck me, and I'm really thinking through everything you've said from this lens of thinking about the question of who are we as human beings, and what does that then mean in the space that we are on. A comment that's come up on YouTube, SK is reflecting that Africa cannot conceivably buy itself back with frantic incantations of its humanness. The so-called humanness is a notional trap plotted in a desperate bid to invest Africa with a moral leverage in a field where the questions of moral superiority become irrelevant. So I'm just thinking about that. SK is thinking with you. And I'm wondering if you could just, as we come to a close, what would your final thoughts be? And if you wanted to respond to that comment, please feel free to do so.
It's difficult to respond to a comment like that.
Yeah.
It's very difficult because if you try to practice Ubuntu, it means that you will reflect, and I would have to think very deeply about what this person is saying, because Ubuntu is not just some rhetoric. You have to try to live it. And me, I was brought up as a man, and being brought up as a man means that I have all of the limitations of masculinity and all the limitations of being socialized in a society where masculine privilege and power oppress women. So to answer to that question on morality does not bring the questioner to the issues that I was raising about Pan-Africanism as lived experience. Let me just make two small points. That everywhere you have Africans, they live in multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual society. So Pan-Africanism is about diversity and unity. Walter Rodney was assassinated because as a Pan-Africanist dealing with the working peoples of Guyana, those who were Pan-African leaders in Guyana killed him because he was working for the unification of the Indian and African workers. So in every country where we have Africans, we have people in multi-ethnic, multilingual, multiracial spaces. So Pan-Africanism must be the affirmation of how we bring out the best of our humanity. The second point I want to make is one cannot talk about being a Pan-Africanist and support the exploitation and dehumanization of other human beings. One of the things that, when I came to Nairobi to speak about Pan-Africanism, some people who from Bungale Wananchi said that I'm supporting homosexuality. I said, what? Because I talk about the rights of same-gender loving persons. And the point among Pan-Africanists, you cannot be a Pan-Africanist and support the oppression of other human beings on any grounds whatsoever. So when you have homophobic leaders and call themselves Pan-Africanists, those who are progressive Pan-Africanists, who understand their limitations as human beings, have to fight for the freedom, dignity, and humanity of all other human beings, whether women or people of different sexual orientation. Those are the last points I would want to make in terms of how, but the point is, we are in a period of the revitalization of the African. The revitalization of the Africans has come from four things, and I hope they will link my essay in The Elephant. I talk the revitalization, the military defeat of South Africa at Kutupalabale. And most young people do not know that this was a turning point for the Pan-African movement. The release of Nelson Mandela, the World Conference Against Racism, the African Union, and now the Black Lives Matter internationally, affirming the dignity, humanity of Africans in all parts of the world. These are 5 elements of the revitalization of Africa that I think young people need to pay attention.
Mwalimu, thank you very, very, very much. You was somebody I was really looking forward to speaking to. I call you Mwalimu because I think, yes, I know you're a professor of political science and African American studies, but I think you really embody what it means to be a teacher, and a teacher in all the best ways possible, that going beyond the theory, but not taking lightly the importance of the intellectual work that undergirds the way we live, the way we perceive the world, the way we are able to see in other people ourselves. I've really, really appreciated that centering of thinking about Pan-Africanism as, yes, a global struggle that's anchored in Africa, but that's working constantly towards making it possible for all of us to fulfill our full humanity. I really have taken on board that often when we talk about Pan-Africanism, people make it abstract. They talk about theories, and they talk about these sites that seem very far removed from many ordinary people, but that you've just taken it back to, yes, there are those big spaces where we must go in and we must do these important and very practical projects that bring us towards fulfilling this vision and this dream. But that it actually begins where we live, in our homes, in the places we worship, in the everyday things that we do in the community, in the music we listen to, in the books that we read, so that whatever it is that we are doing, we're bringing this eye of what does it mean that I am a human being? What does it mean that there's a struggle that is anchored in this space, and how do I live this through? And I know we'll be coming back to this. I've also really, really appreciated that you've given us not only your own thoughts to think about, and we will be sharing on the elephant, your essay again, but that you've also given us a whole range of people to look up. You've put in the names of people we should be reading. You've given us articles. You've given us so much to think about. And I really, really want to thank you very, very much for that. I think those of you who are in the Zoom webinar, we've already put that link right into the chat, but we'll be sharing that also on YouTube and when we put this up on the elephant. I want to thank every participant who has joined us today. I know there will be more people who will be joining us in the weeks to come. I thank you for your questions. I thank you for your comments. So many of them were coming that there is much more that we can talk about, and I do hope that we will be able to continue this conversation. Please share this conversation. Please look it up on YouTube if you want to share it with others on the elephant. We will be continuing the Pan-African forums. This is our last forum for this year, but we will be coming back in January and February and moving on into 2021, continuing to explore what does it mean to struggle and to find our humanity and the humanity of others, anchored in the space that is Africa, but looking at the whole way that global Africa is thinking through all these conversations, thinking through all these projects together. I can only finish by quoting Khadija George, who says everything I want to say so well in one word: fantastic. Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for these important discussions, which have been very empowering. Those are the words of Ruth Kamau. And so we leave you. We hope and wish everybody all the best as we continue to see out this pandemic season. May you have a wonderful end to 2020, and we look forward to joining you again in 2021. From myself, from Professor Campbell, from our hosts, the Elephant, Alliance Française de Nairobi, and IFRA Nairobi, we hope to see you again. Good night.